Hello, and welcome back to the Sinobabble podcast. It's been a while since the last episode, and if you are a regular listener, I just want to apologise for the huge gap. If you also subscribe to my newsletter, you'll know that there's been a lot going on at the moment, and I've only just recovered from a really bad head cold that might also have been COVID. I wasn't even able to speak for 3 weeks. So hopefully from now on we can get back to our regularly scheduled programme. So, without further ado, let's just jump right into the episode for this week. More than 2 decades after his demise, the case of Lin Biao, who became Mao Zedong's personally anointed successor in 1966, but was denounced as an unprincipled conspirator following his death 5 years later, remains the most obscure and controversial case of top-level elite conflict in the history of the Chinese Communist Party. While the official version of Lin's death in September 1971, as the result of a plane crash while fleeing to the Soviet Union, is widely disbelieved both in and outside of China, this appears the least problematic aspect of the party's account of Lin Biao during the Cultural Revolution. More problematic is the story of the military coup plans and an assassination plot directed against Mao by Lin in the last desperate period of his political decline. Apart from the question of whether such plans did actually exist, there is much to suggest that, to the extent that they did, it was Lin's son, Lin Guo, who organised these projects without his father being aware. Yet, it is concerning more fundamental political questions that not only the official account, but also the basic thrust of Western analysis are in most need of re-examination. How did Lin Biao ascend to the position of successor to Mao? Why did he fall so precipitously in 1970 to 1971? What were Lin's objectives, methods, and roles over the entire 1966 to 71 period? What does the case of Lin Biao tell us about the nature of Chinese politics in the Cultural Revolution period? So what I just read was a really long quote, and it's actually the first paragraph of a very important book called The Tragedy of Lin Biao, Riding the Tiger During the Cultural Revolution, which was written by Frederick Tews and Warren Sun. I chose this paragraph because I don't think there's actually a better summary of the Lin Biao incident as a whole, and it also asks some really, really important questions. And I think those questions are really fundamental, not only to understanding sort of who Lin Biao was and what his role was, but like the paragraph said, understanding politics in the Cultural Revolution. So we've talked a lot in the past episodes about how people sort of rose and fell, how different cliques came into power and then were replaced or superseded by other cliques, and how there was a lot of battle for power going on during the Cultural Revolution. And so the case of Lin Biao is kind of representative of a broader power struggle that was going on in China at the time. So what we're going to try and do in this episode is answer most of those questions, and just in general talk about Lin Biao as a person, because I don't think we've really spoken about him that much. We've spoken about sort of policies he's been involved in or decisions that he's made, but a lot of sort of revisionist history has been written about Lin Biao recently, in the past 30 or 40 years, that kind of rehabilitate his character somewhat. I think in the Chinese version of events, he is definitely the villain for very important reasons, which we will get to. But when revisiting sort of his life and his politics, I think there's been kind of a shift in attitude, particularly in Western accounts, as to who Lin Biao was and what his character really was. Also, just in general, the Lin Biao incident is actually one of my favourite conspiracy theories. We're not going to talk that much about the plane crash, we're going to talk more about the politics, but in general, I do think that it is one of those very interesting unsolved mysteries as to his death, which we'll talk about later on in the episode. So, when it comes to Lin Biao, even though he was technically very important during the Cultural Revolution, he's kind of been a background figure for the past few episodes, and I don't think we actually talk about him at all before the Lushan Conference in 1959, where he replaces our poor dear Peng Dehuai as the Minister of Defense. It doesn't really help that, like most leaders of the CCP during this period, it's actually quite difficult to separate his private belief from his public ones, and because he does fall from grace quite spectacularly, many accounts of him have been altered posthumously to make him seem more of a villain than he probably was. So I'm going to try and remain neutral on the topic, although, sympathies where they're due. So hopefully by outlining exactly who he was, we can get a clearer picture of why Lin came to power so quickly and why he lost it just as fast. and why his death is even important to the story of the Cultural Revolution. So first, as always, let's give a little bit of biographical background for today's main character so we can understand where he was coming from and how he reached such a high position by the 1960s. Lin Biao was born in a place called Huanggang in Hubei province in December 1907. He joined the Whampoa Military Academy in 1925 when it was being run by Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalists, as well as Zhou Enlai, when the CCP and the Nationalists still had an alliance before the Shanghai Massacre in 1927. After 1927, Lin joined Mao and many other communists in the Jiangxi Soviet, where he not only became close with Mao himself, but he also won a series of very important military battles that distinguished him as a very capable commander. His troops successfully defended the Jiangxi Soviet during the first four of Chiang Kai-shek's encirclement campaigns, and when the fifth campaign saw the beginning of the Long March, it was actually Lin's troops who managed to break through the nationalist forces and created a route out for the rest of the party. During the Long March, Lin's troops effectively cleared the way for the party to make their way up to the Yan'an area and saved the army from complete extermination. After this, he was promoted really quickly. In 1932, at the age of just 26, he took over from Zhu De as the military commander of the 1st Army Corps, becoming the 4th ranking member of the Military Commission, and at that time he was also elected as a member of the Central Committee of the CCP. In Yan'an, Lin became the head of the Red Army Academy and took up a leading role in the fight against Japan. It was during this period that he sustained a wound that would continue to plague him for the rest of his career, and this wound is quite important because it kind of helps explain why he was such a background figure in politics, especially in the 1960s when he gets a bit older. But by that point, it didn't really matter that he wasn't so at the forefront of all the fighting, because his prowess had already been very well established. He did do some fighting against the nationalists in the northeast during the Civil War in 1945, and he spent a lot of time establishing the CCP's land reform policy in rural areas during this period as well. Just to prove his military greatness further, he also crossed the Yangtze River in April 1949 to take Wuhan, which is also in Hubei province, and Guangzhou in Guangdong province by October, which made him one of the most prolific and celebrated military leaders of the Communist Party. After the PRC was established in 1949, Lin's poor health, presumably caused by the wound that we talked about, prevented him from attending very many political events. He also advocated against any more fighting, arguing that China should not send troops into Korea, and he also declined to go himself. He took sick leave for most of the first few years of the regime, keeping mainly to himself and his family, just staying in their compound, in their residence. According to records, he apparently only worked for about 1 hour each day, leaving most of the work to his many secretaries and rarely giving an opinion one way or another on most issues, whether it was a military problem or a political one. So that's kind of a career background for Lin. As to his character, you might assume that somebody who rose up very quickly would have been very ambitious or very power hungry, but apparently this wasn't actually the case with Lin, although accounts do differ. Again, here I'm sticking with Warren Sun and Frederick Hughes' interpretation of Lin. There are many others out there, but I think this one is becoming the more accepted one. There are other books to read. I'll try and list some resources if you're interested in looking at other points of view on Lin's character. So, according to Hughes and Sun, unlike some of the other characters that we've looked at during this period, like Jiang Chunqiao, Wang Hongwen, or Mao's wife Jiang Qing, Lin Biao seems to have been very happy to operate behind the scenes, and apart from being very loyal to Mao, he didn't really get very much involved in politics. He was known for being an excellent military leader, as we discussed, very trustworthy, and he was also the only high-ranking official who didn't go against Mao on any issue at any point between 1949 and 1966. Even people like Liu Shaoqi and Zhou Enlai disappointed Mao on a number of occasions. So they had this long-standing relationship, which is very important because it predates the 1935 Zunyi Conference, which is when Mao sort of rose to his prominent position within the party. So the fact that Lin still supported Mao when other members of the Communist Party wanted to get rid of him in the late 20s and early 30s was probably a very big factor in Mao's decision to eventually make him his successor. Even if he didn't always agree with Mao, he always carried out his orders, or he did what he believed Mao would have wanted, which is a very crucial thing to remember throughout this episode. Something that's very interesting about Lin is that his family was very much involved in his political life. So his children actually worked for him and helped him prepare his speeches and his documents, and his son had a nominal but very prominent position within the Air Force. He seems to have had a very fiery, but at the same time very loving relationship with his wife, and he was close with his children, one of whom, Lin Guo, this is the guy who worked in the Air Force, becomes very important later on in the story. The role of Lin's wife, Ye Chun, is very significant, as many reports state that she basically ran interference for Lin Biao. She intercepted his messages and even signed documents on his behalf without actually asking him first. She apparently would often manipulate him and lie to him, as well as to other people, telling people that he was too unwell to be disturbed, and just acting in a way that she felt was in his best interest, or in the family's best interest. So a good example would be the fact that Lin, like most people, did not get on with Jiang Qing, Mao's wife. And so Ye Chun would often go and see Jiang Qing herself and act as sort of a go-between and try and smooth out relations so that the two wouldn't argue, which they often did if they met in public. She also made sure to suck up to Jiang Qing because Jiang obviously had a higher position being Mao's wife. This isn't to say that Lin had no agency or authority. He was still a very powerful man. Some reports say that he could be very shrewd and calculating. When reflecting on his rise to power during the Great Leap Forward, he apparently made the following comment that, quote, "Whoever did not speak falsely fell from power." So this kind of suggests that even though he may not have inwardly agreed with what was going on, he basically felt that he wasn't stupid enough to actually voice his opinions or act like someone like Peng Dehuai and try and do the right thing, which would potentially annoy Mao. He actually continued this trait of speaking falsely after the Great Leap Forward too, presumably again to avoid falling from grace, especially as his political position was getting much, much higher and therefore much more precarious. But this isn't necessarily the same thing as being power-hungry, at least not in my opinion. As we've seen from the decline and fall of other party members, once you're expelled or arrested, the poor conditions and ill treatment that you get would mean that your health would rapidly deteriorate, and in many cases, death would swiftly follow. So, as Lin Biao was already in poor health before the Cultural Revolution, it did make sense that he simply tried to maintain his position and not cause any sort of waves, so as to avoid basically dying. So let's talk more about Lin's role during the Cultural Revolution. Even though Lin Biao was a member of the Politburo, which is the highest decision-making body within the CCP, by the beginning of the 1960s, he doesn't seem to have become more political as a result, and he just simply remained consistent in his attitude towards his work and his support for basically whatever Mao said. One example is in the case of the purge of Luo Ruiqing, Lin's military chief of staff, at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, which we discussed in episode 1 on this topic. So, although it was clear that there was tension between Luo and Lin, it seems to have surrounded work matters more than political matters. So Lin's problems with Luo were either personal or they were to do with how the military was actually being run. He did write to Mao to complain about Luo, but it's not entirely clear that Lin asked for Luo to be taken down or kicked out of the party or anything like that. Also, it can't really be said that he was taking advantage of the Cultural Revolution because the incident of Luo Ruiqing happened before the Cultural Revolution had even begun. And even if you could say, okay, well, getting rid of Luo Ruiqing made it easier for Lin to rise up as Mao's successor, there are reports that state that Lin actually tried to turn down the position of becoming Mao's successor and only accepted after Mao insisted that he take it on. So again, he was trying not to disappoint Mao or upset him in any way. Like I said, there are many conflicting accounts as to why Lin did the things that he did, and you can't really be sure what he was thinking at any time. I think one thing that we can be sure of is that Lin was just trying to keep in Mao's good graces at all time, and that this was basically the best way to avoid being purged or beaten to death by the Red Guards. Lin continued being loyal to Mao all throughout the Cultural Revolution. He worked very hard to promote Mao's ideology and political training within the army, including Mao Zedong thought and the idea of Mao as supreme leader, someone who could do no wrong. Mao actually kind of felt uneasy about this at times, writing to Jiang Qing on one occasion saying that sometimes Lin's overzealousness made him a bit uncomfortable. But apart from Luo Ruiqing and a couple of other people, Lin also seemed to get on well with other military leaders. And his position of number 2 within the party was widely accepted by pretty much everyone. So you might think that someone, say for example Zhou Enlai, who was premier at the time, may have wanted to have been promoted to Mao's number 2 after Liu Shaoqi had been purged, but Zhou had actually gone against Mao on a few issues in the past, and in general he seemed to be happy to be head of the bureaucratic side of running the country, so he was head of the government. Besides, I think in reality, Zhou Enlai still had more power in the actual day-to-day running of the country than Lin had as vice-chairman of the party, due to his previous experience and also due to Lin Biao's poor health. So this was something that many probably felt would stay the same even if Mao Zedong passed away. Zhou himself also wasn't much younger than Mao, and so he probably didn't feel very power-hungry. He was probably just quite happy with his position. In fact, in some places it's written that Zhou Enlai crossed his name off the list of candidates for Mao's successor at the 11th plenum in 1966. So I think we can say for certain that Zhou Enlai didn't want the position, and a lot of people were happy or just okay with Lin Biao taking over from Liu Shaoqi. So Lin was fairly popular, despite not being a prominent political figure, and he had Mao's trust, as he always enforced Mao's will. But Lin also did have his own opinions, which didn't always align with what Mao said, and it sometimes made him feel a bit uneasy about accepting the position of successor. If Lin seemed somewhat of a background character, despite his rise to power, it was probably because he was deliberately trying to make himself so. He was well aware that he had become more vulnerable as Mao's successor, and that Mao could easily turn against him, even though he'd initially fully supported him. He'd seen Mao twist other people's words and trick them into falling for his traps. He was also privately sympathetic to people like Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, who had been purged during the Cultural Revolution, apparently calling them good comrades and pointing out that Liu Shaoqi actually had better theoretical knowledge than Mao. Apparently he once said of Mao that, quote, "He worships himself and has blind faith in himself. He worships himself to the extent that all accomplishments are attributed to him, but all mistakes are made by others." During the Cultural Revolution, Lin Biao remained reclusive, seeing few people, attending mass rallies when basically forced to by his wife, reading only summaries of even the most important documents, and speaking only when he made public speeches. When one of his subordinates was facing an imminent purging, he warned him to be, quote, passive, passive, and passive again, and took his own advice by doing nothing to protect this same colleague when he was finally purged. He wanted to keep the military out of the Cultural Revolution, and worried that by overly supporting Mao, the integrity of the PLA would diminish. Though some of the official records state that Lin worked together with Jiang Qing's group to cause chaos and eliminate his opposition within the military, other accounts portray Lin as kind of scared of all the chaos, both for his own position and for the disruption caused to the army. As I stated earlier, he didn't actually like Jiang Qing and probably would have resented her calling him up to make the PLA deal with her petty squabbles with the cadres and Zhou Enlai. He doesn't really show up in momentous events like the February Adverse Current that we spoke about, I think in episode 3, where many senior leaders of the Communist Party meet up to complain about the Cultural Revolution, which then caused a huge backlash later on in the year. His major concerns throughout the early period of the Cultural Revolution seem to have been avoiding making waves and preventing as far as possible the seizure of arms by Red Guards and any attacks on local military leaders. So, I think we've neatly summarised Lin's life and his sort of attitude to politics and how he worked and operated within the bounds of the Cultural Revolution. Given this assessment of Lin's character, why was it that Mao came to suspect that he was planning a coup against him? And what could Lin's political ambitions have been, considering that he was going to be the successor anyway? According to mainstream narratives, Lin felt that the power base that the PLA had built up during the course of the Cultural Revolution was being threatened by the lightning-speed rehabilitation of party cadres from 1968 onwards. Once Mao was past the sort of chaotic element of the Cultural Revolution, he started reinstating cadres who had been dismissed from the party or the government and diminishing the overall role and power of the army. From April 1969 onwards, after the Ninth Congress had concluded, an intense secret political battle was being fought between Lin and Mao until the former's death just a few years later. Lin apparently stood against domestic and foreign policies implemented by Mao, while Mao worked to remove those sympathetic or allied with Lin from positions of power. While his picture was being printed alongside Mao's in national newspapers, Lin and his cronies planned to depose Mao, were caught, and then a startled Lin attempted to flee, only for his plane to crash land in a mountain somewhere in Mongolia, killing himself and all others on board. This is sort of the official summary of what happened, but this kind of evaluation not only relies on internal and public documents released by the CCP, many of which paint Lin as the baddie in the situation for obvious reasons, but they also rely on sort of preconceived notions by Western and Chinese historians that Lin was power-hungry, he was a careerist, and he was someone who would do anything to ensure his own position and power base. But was this necessarily the case? More revisionist accounts that are by no means sympathetic to the PRC or the Cultural Revolution or even to Lin Biao seem to suggest that any tensions between Mao and Liu following the Ninth Congress were completely blown out of proportion by later historians. Yes, there were some disagreements over the importance of, say, production versus politics, as well as the issue of how to evaluate Mao's genius, but most of these issues were passing issues. Talk that Lin stood against Mao's foreign policy objections also have been questioned. It seems that Mao actually agreed with Lin on the topic of a border dispute between China and the Soviet Union as to how important it was to national security. And contrary to reports that Lin disliked the idea of rapprochement with the US, apparently he was actually very excited when he heard that Richard Nixon was going to visit in 1972, and he very uncharacteristically asked his secretary to make sure that he would be ready to greet Nixon and his team when they left the country. There was some tension between the two, there's no doubt about that. So it seems that after August 1970, at the second plenary meeting of the Ninth Congress, which was held at Lushan, yes, the same Lushan where Peng Dehuai had been deposed, there's a situation that sort of goes down. So a brief summary of the events goes as follows. Lin Biao and Mao's former secretary Chen Boda insist that the position of chairman of the PRC, so not chairman of the party, which is the role that exists today as general secretary. We're talking about chairman of the PRC. So they want the position of chairman of the PRC to be reinstated because Mao had given it up when he handed over the reins to Liu Shaoqi, and then he abolished the position when Liu was purged. So chairman of the PRC no longer exists as a role. So what people say is that Lin Biao and Chen Boda come up with this idea so that Mao would then refuse to take up the position, and then it would naturally fall onto Lin Biao, and therefore ensure that Lin Biao had sort of his position shored up and make sure that he could bring up the dominance of the military. Apparently, the reason that Lin Biao wanted this to happen was because Mao had at some point suggested that Jiang Chunqiao, head of the Communist Party in Shanghai at this time, be made Lin Biao's heir. So Mao said to Lin, why don't you make Jiang your heir? But Jiang was much, much younger. So Lin basically felt that Mao was surreptitiously trying to replace him with the much younger man. Lin and Chen suggest that Mao takes up the position of chairman of the PRC. Mao then refuses, stating that it should go to whoever wants it. So he doesn't say that the position should remain abolished, he just said someone else should take it. At that point, Lin Biao then makes a speech in front of the entire plenum, insisting that Mao take on the role of head of state and supreme commander, and again re-emphasizes Mao's genius and the guiding role of Mao Zedong thought. Chen Boda even drafted a clause in the constitution about the chairmanship and sent round a bulletin stating that anyone who opposed it was opposing the idea of Mao as a genius. When Mao got wind of all of these events, he asked that Chen's bulletin be recalled and that the head of the Cultural Revolutionary Group issue a self-criticism. He then sent out his own document accusing Chen of bourgeois idealism, sophistry, and rumour-mongering, and eventually Chen was actually dismissed from office entirely. So I think the question here is, did Lin Biao really try and strengthen his own position by suggesting that Mao become chairman of the PRC again? Was he really afraid of being replaced by Jiang Qunqiao and therefore going for a bigger power grab in order to ensure his own position? Lin never actually suggested that he himself take up the position of chairman. I think that's something that's quite important to point out. Many of his staff confessed in later interviews that his wife was actually the one who had pushed the issue so hard. It's been suggested that Lin and Chen were just trying to please Mao, and Mao only made very vague comments about it. He never outright said that the chairmanship should be avoided. He was just like, whatever, whoever wants it can have it. Someone like Chen Boda as well had kind of been pushed aside by younger people like Jiang Qunqiao and Yao Wenyuan, and he was probably just working really hard to try and get back in Mao's favour. But whether it's the revisionist historians or the Lin is the bad guy historians, everyone sees this moment as a very important turning point in the relationship between Lin Biao and Mao Zedong. I think from our perspective, this kind of thing seems like quite a small issue, but I think the reason it's so important is that in communist countries, but especially in China at this time, the idea of chairman is, the big picture above the gate at Tiananmen Square. It is supreme leader. If you think about the importance of someone like Xi Jinping in China today, even though he's not chairman of the country, he is the president, he's also chairman of the party as general secretary. You're kind of seen as someone who is unassailable, as who has the final say, who's revered by everyone in the country. It's a very secure position to be in and very powerful as well. So I think it can just be interpreted as a power grab. It's not something that I think, if you're listening from a Western sort of democratic country, we don't treat our figureheads like that, so to speak. But at this point in time, especially when communist politics were so heavily based around individuals, especially supreme individuals within their parties, I think this was a very, very important issue. So that's why it became such a controversial moment in the relationship between Lin Biao and Mao. So the Lushan conference is adjourned in September, and it's apparently at this point that Lin began plans to stage a coup against Mao. Many historians use a quote given by Lin at the end of the conference, where he says, "Using civilian means doesn't work, using armed forces works," as a sign that he was preparing to move against the chairman. Some paint Lin as being reactive to Mao's own measures during the period of September 1971, such as when Chen Boda was purged because he was so closely allied with Lin at the time, while some other people portray Lin as being very passive, which was probably more accurate because that would have been more in keeping with his personality. In fact, in general, it's just very difficult to find any accounts of sort of strategic political or military action taken by Lin between 1970 and 1971. And there are also some questions about Mao's own motives. For example, he did purge Chen for his actions about pushing the idea of the chairmanship, but he didn't purge Lin. If he had been suspicious of Lin at this point, why wouldn't he just get rid of him? He got rid of Liu Shaoqi much easier. If anything, it seems as if Mao had actually gone out of his way to protect Lin from being purged, because someone like Jiang Qing, for example, wouldn't have minded getting rid of him. Mao was definitely upset with Lin's poor self-criticism, which he gave out at the Lushan conference. He also made a lot of personnel changes so that those who were loyal to Mao and Jiang Qing were put in positions of power and replaced people who were directly loyal to Lin. So you can see there was like a little shift in the power balance there. The people who were in charge of running the Beijing army were both replaced with people who were more loyal to Mao than to Lin. But if the tensions were rising at this point, I don't think a lot of people actually seem to have noticed. In fact, other party leaders at the time commented that everything seemed fine, and the only people who really worried about the relationship between Mao and Lin and tried to do something to fix it were Lin's family and Zhou Enlai. There are a lot of accounts that say that Mao was getting bitter and cranky in his old age, and he was more obsessed with acts of deference, things like really over-the-top self-criticisms, as opposed to any concrete evidence of political loyalty. When he was touring the country between August and September 1971, Mao apparently said to some people that Lin Biao was no longer to be trusted, and he compared Lin to other people like Peng Dehuai and Liu Shaoqi, which is not a comparison that you would have wanted to be made. So the tides were turning against Lin Biao for whatever reason, and so the question is, was it Lin who tried to do something to stop it, or was it somebody else? So according to some official historical takes, either independently or at his father's behest, Lin Liguo, Lin Biao's son, organised a band of officers under his command in the Air Force between the 20th and the 24th of March to plot with them to remove Mao from power, a plot that became known as the 571. It seems that the plan escalated to ideas of assassination in August after Mao's southern tour where he started slagging off Lin Biao, and then at this point Lin Biao apparently gave his blessing to his son to move forward with his plans. So the plan was to attack Mao's train as it made its way back to the capital from his southern tour, but apparently Mao's, quote, instinct for survival, honed by long years of guerrilla warfare, came into play, and he decided to travel at different times, making unexpected stops here and there, eventually pulling into Beijing earlier than intended. So Lin Liguo decided that the plot should nevertheless be continued, or at least the family should fly to Canton to try and set up a rival government. He argued with his sister, Dodo, about the subject, and Dodo said that their father, should just retire, live out the rest of his days in peace, and stop with all this political infighting. But Liguo basically just ignored her, stating that she was being naive, and instead worked with his mother to try and move things along quickly. So on September the 12th, Lin Dodo was actually having an engagement party at the family's residence, and the brother arrived back at the residence to confer with his mother Ye Chun and his dad. So Ye Chun then called Zhou Enlai in Beijing to let him know that the family was taking a trip by a plane. At this point, she goes and wakes up her husband. He had apparently taken a sleeping pill or something like that, so he had to be woken up while everyone else was busy burning documents, and they just sort of ran off in the middle of the night. They got to their private plane, which took off at 12:32 a.m. on September the 13th. Although their daughter Lin Dodo did not go with them, apparently she was not a favourite with her mother at all. Her mum used to make very disparaging comments about her. Even though her dad loved her a lot, he was ill a lot of the time and so couldn't do anything to defend her. Apparently one time she tried to commit suicide as well. She kind of seems to have been an outsider in the family, which I think is why she spilled so much detail about the inner workings of the family after her parents' and her brother's death. But anyway, Zhou Enlai hears that Ye Chun, Lin Biao, Lin Liguo, and some other people have got on this private plane. He tries to get the plane grounded, and then he goes over to see Mao to ask him whether or not they should shoot down the plane. Mao apparently answers in his typically vague way, saying that, quote, rain has to fall, women have to marry, these things are immutable, let them go. Zhou then rushes back to convene a Politburo meeting at 3 a.m. to make preparations to defend Mao in case of an assassination attempt. However, no attack ever comes, because the next day, Zhou Enlai receives a call from the Chinese embassy in Ulaanbaatar saying that Lin Biao's Trident had crashed at approximately 2:30 a.m. on the 13th of September near Underkan in Mongolia, killing the 8 men and 1 woman on board. So that's the summary of events as they're officially told. The story portrays Lin Biao as an active agent in his attempted coup against Mao, working with his son in a very poorly planned attempt to launch himself into power early. However, this interpretation of events has been heavily questioned, and other studies put forward the idea that not only was Lin Biao unaware of what was going on, but in fact there was no coup plotted at all, and his family just made a last-minute decision to flee the country before Lin Biao could be arrested and die in prison. So like I said, Lin Biao had undoubtedly fallen out of favour with Mao at this time, and being more reactive than he was active, it's possible that they were just sort of reading the writing on the wall and decided to take the initiative to just leave before things get bad. No one else in the party was privy to any coup, even though Lin Biao was very, very close with the other 4 military commanders under his command. Also, like I said, his daughter was having an engagement party at the time. Having a big party at your house when you think you're about to be deposed and arrested seems a little bit too convenient. I don't think that would have made a very good distraction tactic. Also, the fact that he had to be woken up in the middle of the night to flee the scene just strikes me as odd. Surely, if he was someone who was on very high alert and thought that he could be sort of arrested or was planning to flee at any moment, wouldn't take a sleeping pill at such a critical time. Also, there's the issue of people speculating that they were going to set up a rival government in Canton. Why were they then flying towards Mongolia or perhaps the Soviet Union? Why not fly south? The whole thing just reeks of sort of a political spin put on the event by official party historians in order to protect Mao's image. Whether or not Lin's plane was shot down, sabotaged, or simply crashed is still unknown. It will probably remain a mystery forever. Even if official party communiques and archives are opened up to the public, the true thoughts of Lin Biao, of his family, and most importantly of Mao, can probably only ever be known to those people at the time when it all happened. By his own admittance, Lin Biao was an excellent military strategist, but a mediocre politician. He was unable to coax or persuade, he was easily manipulated even by members of his own family, he was inattentive to the events going on in his own house, and basically didn't spend enough time reading the fine print to know how to act or how to provide an alternative narrative to whatever Mao put forward. When I was doing the reading, there was a highly illustrative story that I came across. Lin's family had a swimming pool built in their complex, and Lin Biao didn't even know about it until it was finished, and someone had to tell him about it when they finished constructing it. So that just goes to show how much Lin Biao got out and was interested in what was going on around him. Even if Lin Biao did disagree with Mao in private, he would always agree with him in public. And this attitude no doubt led to conflict within himself and also between him and Mao. Though he was cunning, withdrawn, sickly, and cynical, Lin was also principled, and he did clearly adore Mao. Mao was also old and probably a bit sickly and apparently tired of most people around him. Remember, this is all happening in 1970 and 1971. Mao dies in 1976, so it's not like he's around for a really long time after this. He's clearly coming to the end by this point. One historian wrote that Mao had struggled to make the transition from guerrilla leadership to charismatic leader of an actual nation. The failure to play a role as economic and political planner, leading the country from one disaster to another, obviously affected his relationship with those closest to him, which we saw in the case of Liu Shaoqi. Is it any surprise, therefore, that just a few years later, his next successor would suffer exactly the same fate? Lin was nowhere near as adept at playing politics as Liu Shaoqi was. So was it really realistic that he would survive longer than Liu Shaoqi, considering that he was standing that close to the centre of a political storm? He definitely lacked the shrewdness of someone like Zhou Enlai, who seems to have survived every political movement and every wave of purging from which other high-ranking officials suffered at one point or another. If he was playing power politics, he was not very good at it. After all, the main contention was a power struggle between civilian cadres and the PLA, so why did more of the army not come out to support Lin when he was threatened with being purged? Why did he have to run off with his son instead of gathering the so-called coup forces that he had amassed and actually staging a coup? Many of these questions will probably remain unanswered. Regardless of whether Lin was involved in the conspiracy or not, whether the plane crash was an accident or sabotage, or if the plot existed at all, the fall of Lin Biao did have a huge impact on several aspects of the Cultural Revolution. The first thing to note is that the prestige of the army fell, and also the role of the cadres rose as a result of Lin's death and fall from grace. So as we discussed in previous episodes, as mass organizations were pushed out of major political roles, the main struggle for dominance of China's political system was between the party cadres under Zhou Enlai and the military. So by painting Lin Biao as a black hand who had worked behind the scenes with other PLA leaders to discredit the Cultural Revolution and overthrow Mao, the whole rank and role of the PLA fell precipitously. The army then played less and less of a role in political life, and Mao and other civilian cadres worked to sort of unpick the martial law aspects of daily life and restore normal social order to the country. So that's why we see a change in how the Cultural Revolution sort of operates after 1971, which we'll hopefully talk about in the following few episodes. Another interesting thing that happened as a result of Lin Biao's death was that popular morale and positive attitudes towards the Cultural Revolution actually declined. Ordinary people who weren't privy to sort of the inner workings of the party really struggled to understand why Lin Biao would do what he was accused of doing, how the omnipotent and all-powerful Mao had failed to spot what was going on, and how the Cultural Revolution in general could fail so spectacularly. People who were following the political developments of the Cultural Revolution closely quickly became disillusioned, even more so than when the Red Guards had been disbanded and the active phase of the Cultural Revolution had been brought to an end so abruptly. As one student wrote, quote, "This incident shocked me and made me question the nature of the Cultural Revolution. Was it really an unprecedented revolution in human history led by a group of men and a few women with vision and exemplary moral integrity as I had believed? Or was it just a power struggle that started at the top and later permeated the whole country?" Another student wrote, quote, "Chairman Mao's hand-picked successor betrayed him and even wanted to kill him. My trust in many things suddenly turned shaky. It was like you'd been walking firmly towards a goal and felt good about it, then one day you found out that that goal was only an illusion." This skepticism morphed into general dissatisfaction with life in China, and a niggling discontent with the party that manifested in dispersed, disruptive activities. According to one author, quote, "The decline of the party's capacity for control was accompanied by slackening discipline, increasing numbers of crimes, illegal exchange of goods and services, various forms of petty corruption, widespread consumer scarcity, and more. Slowdowns, absenteeism, and thefts of supplies were prevalent in factories." We also discussed in the last episode how fighting and other aberrant behaviours like massacres and cannibalism took place even after the revolutionary committees had been restored in 1971. The mass phase of the Cultural Revolution had increased people's political consciousness and ability to organise and express themselves and their beliefs in the face of authority. So now that the mass phase was over, it wasn't like the people could just go back to being treated as dumb subjects who would swallow whatever was served up to them. Many people now had questions. They wanted to know how it was possible to criticise Lin Biao without also criticising the system that had produced him. Surely the regime as a whole had to be examined. This obviously created a problem for the party, which had now opened itself to being challenged by the masses, and those who were critical or suspicious of the party would continue to hold on to those feelings until the end of the Cultural Revolution and well after the Mao years were over. This wave of popular social criticism swelled during the late 1970s, during the transition phase after Mao's death, and would eventually be brought to order under the influence of economic modernization and rational planning. But that wasn't until one more event took place at the end of the 1980s, which was again to be swiftly crushed by the CCP, ensuring the dominance of the party to the present day. So, that's it for this episode, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, sorry that it's been so long between episodes. I promise they'll be coming out more frequently. And again, I do hope that we will finish the Cultural Revolution before the summer. Even I want to move on at this point. Don't forget that this podcast has a newsletter as well. You can subscribe by going to the Sinobabble website and filling in your details, or by going over to Substack and searching there for Sinobabble. You can also donate to support the podcast if you want by going to sinobabble.com and clicking on the donate button. You can make a one-off or monthly contribution. Any amount at all is very much appreciated. If you have Twitter, please follow me there at Sinobabble. And if you're on a podcasting service that allows for ratings, like Apple Podcasts, please do leave a rating, whether it's good or bad. And feel free to send me any feedback you have. I love hearing from you guys. If you have any questions, if you're a student, a teacher, just a general listener who wants to know more about any area of China, do reach out to me. I love hearing from you guys so much. Thanks for listening, and I hope you tune in to the next episode.